Hey, fellow GNTers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So we like to do these little series. We've been working on chipping away at this one, which we will soon complete. 9 things that can fuck up your life, which also should be the first GNT publishing effort. Maybe. We'll see. Yeah. And we had gotten through up to the last few, and they all have something to do with like, we were talking about avoidance and procrastination and these kinds of things. And then we were saying, well, why do people do this? And we got a little bit into the psychology of maybe why people do this. And part of it would be because to go through and really look at yourself can be kind of painful. And then Daniel brought up the thing last time for people who want to check out that episode, which was like, well, what can you do practically about this? And we had the idea to talk about psychological defense mechanisms. And it's a way of like looking at yourself going, wait a minute, I'm engaged in some funky shit here. And you can either recognize it in other people, of course, but you can also turn that mirror towards yourself, and say, I'm doing some funky stuff. And that probably means that I have something weird going on. So the whole theory goes something like, when there's something of psychological discomfort or psychospiritual discomfort, it gets painful. And then there's the whole aspect of the mind will start to protect itself from those things and we'll kind of smush them down. And we were talking about this repression thing, I think last time we were hanging out, Daniel, and it was a good episode.
Yeah.
And now we wanted to look at like, well, what happens when that pressing down, that repression thing happens? And one of the consequences is usually people start acting weird. So when these things get kind of challenged, you don't want to see them. They're kind of continue to be kind of masked underneath the surface. But if they're kind of provoked, you'll elicit like weird behavior out, right? And that's some of the way of knowing, wow, there must be some deeper issue for this person because they're acting weird. Or there must be some deeper issue for me because I'm acting weird, right? Which fits into the whole idea. Like you could also see this as like components of your like existential guardian operating system thing that you kind of tossed.
Yeah.
Right. That, these are like the pieces that maybe make something like that up. Right. So we thought we'd take a peek at them like one at a time. And then it's part of a question of like, that I think the 9 things that can fuck up your life is asking, which is, why do people avoid these things? Do you agree on that basic idea of avoidance, Daniel? Does that make sense to you too? I know we talked about it a little bit, but.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, well, we'll go through it. I mean, that's part of it. That's part of what we're doing when we, while we're doing this.
Okay. So you're into the idea that it's like, it is a major problem.
Yeah, there's no doubt.
I was like talking to Joni Osborne, who was a guest previously, did some really powerful episodes about really, her own experiences with, kind of like sexual violence in some ways too, as well as other parts of her life that she had to overcome. They're really powerful episodes. And if you want to like check those out, you can. And I just threw this at her, like, why are people like this? And her immediate answer was just fear, like almost immediately. And then a lot of this stuff connects back to ideas like, okay, if I'm afraid and I'm trying to repress things, what will pop out instead? Okay, so let's take a tumble at it.
Yeah.
I guess I'll go through the ones that seem like, to me, the most connected to this. And then we'll look at the other ones maybe that get a little bit.
This meaning what, Eric?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So we're looking at the defense mechanisms as outlined by the daughter of Freud, one Anna Freud.
Yes.
There's to the whole list of these things, which it's nice to have a list sometimes, right?
Yeah.
To go through and just look at things, and it kind of once you have a word or a phrase for something, sometimes it's easier to pick up on it, right?
Yeah, and I'll in the description of the podcast, I'll list them out for people. But you could totally do a Google search probably. And if you're going to search something, if you want to kind of, pause the episode and have it in front of you, you would look at the ego defense mechanisms. You could look for like summary chart, ego defense mechanisms, Anna Freud, something like this. And if not, then I will gladly put them in the description and then you guys can, look at it or just listen and absorb whatever happens to fall into your lap as you are doing whatever it is that you are doing right now.
And thinking about emotional insulation.
There we go. Yes, that's right.
The defense mechanism of emotional insulation. So it's kind of a funny thing, it's an old school kind of a list. I got one from like a sort of a standard abnormal psych book.
Yeah.
And they give these kind of funny examples, and some of them are serious examples, actually. So,
Hmm.
okay, the first one that seems kind of, well, maybe I should do intellectualization first, because we got into this talking about things that can fuck up your life. Number 7, which was the idea that people just keep arguing and arguing and arguing and arguing, right? And they never really engage in something more constructive than just the arguing. That
Yeah.
was really funny, Dan. I have 2 friends. The one guy sent out a text and he just wanted to argue about politics, obviously.
Yeah.
So it went out to me and one other guy that I know. So it was the 3 of us. And they were arguing like hell over like days and days. It was just arguing and arguing and arguing. And in the end, the one guy said to me, "What's wrong with Daniel?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he thought it was you.
Mm.
It was a third party in the conversation, Daniel. But I was like, no, Daniel is not the third party in this conversation. And probably Daniel would recognize that better as intellectualization, the defense mechanism, and
Hmm.
wouldn't spend his time bullshitting about this stuff so long. So, anyways, intellectualization, here's what they say about it. They say cutting off effective charge, meaning emotional charge, emotional energy from hurtful situations, or separating incompatible attitudes by logic tight compartments. So that kind of fits, I think, like, I think that's why I started thinking about this with that things that can fuck up your life. Number 7, people who just spend time as opposed to really developing themselves just involved in these empty argumentations. And it got me thinking like, yeah, a lot of the people who are doing that, I think are trying to protect themselves in some way, and all the intellectual shit comes out.
I
And
like
so
the
then this one, the sign is intellectualization is like the indication. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the second half of this too, Eric, where it says separating incompatible attitudes by logic tight compartments, and it
Yeah.
it it disinhibits synthesis of
Mm,
disparate ideas, right?
yeah.
And I think the what do they say? One of the monikers for like intelligence is to be able to hold separate ideas or contrasting ideas simultaneous, but
Yeah.
in kind of in balance with each other. So you can think or believe two different things that don't always, like scientists and their belief of God. You would imagine that sometimes science and God might be two different things, and yet there's plenty of people who are totally engaged in science and also have a very uh, deep spiritual life, as well, like we had on Neil Thies.
I was
Um,
just
yeah, a
Mhm.
couple months ago. So that's like the intellectualization. Uh, and we did talk about a little bit about this last time as like the separation between mind and body, that like you can you can have an understanding of things, but then sometimes you can also have a feeling of things, and those two things are not necessarily the same. And you can describe something to somebody, but only until they kind of like, feel it internally, does it then click in their mind and make sense for something else. And I think that this in particular, what this is referencing is this compartmentalization of ideas or beliefs from other ones. And when you have things separate like this, it's very hard to stack one, as we talked earlier, but before we came on the episode, it's very hard to put the Legos on top of each other to build something when they're just laying in different compartments, never to be built.
I think like, when listening to you talk about this has been interesting to me because we spent like maybe, we'll kind of groove on like one of these ideas for a couple of episodes in a row if it like seems appropriate, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I think in the very first one, you were really interested in how the mind can kind of like dichotomize and fight against itself.
yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's like this part clicks for that with your way of thinking too,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
Mind
mm-hmm,
like dichotomize out and you get all this weird oppositional stuff.
mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll be, I'll take a position versus another person and we'll just argue this out. That can become a certain kind of intellectualization, but you're kind of going like, there can be parts within yourself that seem incompatible and you battle them against one another or
Yeah,
something, right?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean
And
that's embodied in
intellect,
the classic visualization of the two, devil and the angel on each shoulder. Eat the
yeah, yeah,
cheese. Don't eat the cheese. Eat the cheese. Don't eat the cheese. It's good for you. You love it. All right, fine. Fuck it.
yeah, 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 the old like, yeah. I think on the shower curtain of wisdom, are like kind of thing, and I have in the other room with all the different quotes on it. Bob Thurman's one's there. One of Bob Thurman's there is wisdom is tolerance of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Yeah. Where I suppose like you could go. Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. Then you intellectualize stuff to like, again, to smush it, right? That's the whole
Yes.
repression thing, right? Yeah. Which I guess, okay. So then they give these examples, and it is what it is. It says a prisoner on death row awaiting execution resists appeals on his behalf and coldly insists on the letter of the law. Whatever. The examples are kind of are what they are. But
I
yeah,
was
I agree. Yeah.
I was thinking about this from a practitioner standpoint today, and I didn't even know we're, going to be do this. It would fit here, but like, okay, so people want to come, people come in and Eric and I, we're acupuncturists and whatnot. I've been in the field for quite some time now. And people always, and new patients, at least they ask me, well, how does it work? I said, I don't know. How many years do you have for me to explain? They're like, well, just just briefly. I said, I still don't fully understand. How many years do you have for me to explain? And they're like, well,
You
I would
really
like,
do that with patients too?
yeah. I
That's
don't care.
gutsy, Daniel.
Yeah, I don't, what do you want? You know what I'm saying? Like, go look at the degrees on the wall and then
Uh-huh.
ask me to break it down for you in 60 seconds. You don't need to know how it works. You don't go to your surgeon, but they do. People want to know why, because they're intellectual and they're intellectual. It's an intellectualization, right? So I can explain to you that I'll use a personal example so it seems real. I broke my pinky toe, also known as my fifth metatarsal. Not the pinky toe, but the bone that attaches to the pinky toe, and it was split in half. And I had to have a plate. The bone had to be fused to a plate so it would heal properly.
Football injury back in the
Yeah,
day,
that's
Daniel?
football. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
about almost 5 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
Um, and so I can intellectually understand what happened, right? I could look at the X-ray. I heard the pop. I kind of knew what it was, but it doesn't change anything. I know the surgeon's going to go in there and numb it up, slice it open, and put some screws and some bolts and put that thing in. But like, it doesn't change the fact that it still is going to happen, and that I understand the process of it doesn't mean it's going to be any different than if I didn't understand. So I'm a proponent of understanding, but in this case, and I'm arguing outside. The argument is happening inside. The intellectualization is happening on the inside. I'm just arguing it outside so that people can see how this happens so easily. This is the kind of mental jargon that keeps certain aspects of progress um, with an obstacle in front of them for a very long period of time. You know?
You know what strikes me about with these, and I try to think of them with people, whether it's patients or just people that I know, or like with myself too. And I guess that's that we're being proponents of that for this particular episode.
Yeah.
Turn that mirror on yourself. So, like the big thing with these, it seems to me, is that when this shit pops up, then something is buried underneath there,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Something is hidden underneath there that you're trying to like avoid.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you know
Mm-hmm.
it's.
Mm-hmm.
And this one I think is really interesting because some of the dudes I know, and I use the word dudes, I guess, spontaneously, because a lot of times it's dudes, but it's
Yeah.
can be people within the whole spectrum of available people on the planet. Um, uh, I just happened thinking about the two guys who were arguing via text, with one of them thinking it was you. But when you look at intellectualization, I think it's a tough one. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the reason why it gets called out as things that can fuck up your life, number 7, so specifically, because I think this as a defense mechanism is a tricky one because
Yeah.
it makes it seem you're doing something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Really not. And then, what you're really doing is being avoidant of something that's underneath that
Correct.
stuff, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
All right. Well,
I would also look,
let's try and get to do these other ones too, because I feel like they're all good.
they're all valuable.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say one other thing, just like quick about it. If you're like, want to look at this from an artistic point of view, because he's been on my mind this week, is
Sure.
there's a great realist artist named Rene Magritte.
Mm-hmm.
He makes these kind of, if you haven't seen him, you could just do a little quick search on them. He makes these paintings where all of a sudden there'll be like a giant apple blocking something out in the image, or sometimes it's just like a giant sphere. And they're supposed to be a little dreamlike feeling, but his point is that the scary thing is hiding behind something else. He makes a
Mm.
big point about that in the mind. The
Mm.
mind has this like putting up this screen, and these surrealist guys were influenced by people like Freud. That's where they got their thing from. So when you look at a painting of his, there's almost purposely sometimes an object there where you're like, what is that doing there? It doesn't belong there, but it's
Oh yeah.
blocking some canvas. And then okay, that's that's the thing that's scary that you're trying to protect yourself from. And he's just very aware of it. And he talks about it in a very articulate way. He kind of talks about this idea like the thing that's really the thing is the thing that's hidden behind the other thing.
Right.
That's the real, you know? And one of his famous paintings is also like, I think it's called The Lovers, where it's the two people kissing, but they have these sacks over their head. So they don't really know each other on some level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Artificial gap going on. Anyways, I just wanted to throw him out there because I was thinking a lot about him and looking at some of his quotes during the week. Mm. Okay, so that one seems like one to me. One of the other ones that popped out to me related to what things we were talking about was this emotional insulation that I had mentioned earlier. So they say, Anna Freud says, reducing ego involvement by protective withdrawal and passivity. The idea that you kind of like cut away the emotional content and the importance of a thing. You just try to chop it away. I feel like I've had interesting experiences with people doing this lately, where they're
Mm.
just like, there's something really obviously highly emotional going on. I don't feel like I can tell detailed things because it's not my tales to tell. But, you know, I could kind of tell like, wow, this person is showing no emotional interaction with this at all. They're maybe like interacting on some level, talking on some level, but the entire emotional content is being like stripped away, right? And I thought, well, that's so fascinating. That's like a kind of a defense mechanism, and that means there's
Yeah.
probably something weird going, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that one?
That feels kind of like if we're looking at these in terms of like responses, and you have your nervous system doing the responding, right? In a sense, because it's a mental response, but it's also a physical response too. You're getting physiologically pinged when you go through these things. This is like one of the like a withdrawal one, right? And so you have your fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
this one seems definitely like a freeze, you know,
yeah. There's a
because
freezy quality to it, right?
yeah, you're just sort of like it's not a full-on disassociation. That one we'll talk about that one here in a minute.
Uh,
Or that's kind of like a fantasy, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. Maybe they have it, maybe they have one later on that's a little bit more
yeah, I'm looking for like something. They don't know if they have. I think these are the ones that are more dissociative. That like you can cut off the emotions from it.
yeah, so maybe it is something like that, but it's like a freeze or a flight, something like this where you're despondent, you know, it's like you have to remove yourself from the situation, you know, in order to continue. So we call it a defense mechanism, but we could also say it's a survival mechanism also. I don't want to like negatively connotate all of these things. These are adaptations that people learned or they're inherent to somebody and that they get enacted at different times of stress, if you will. And then this is the way in which they're able to cognitively pull themselves through something. Unfortunately, the way you learn to respond to something oftentimes gets repeated unconsciously in the way that you respond to other things from that point forward. And that may not actually be the appropriate response to that stimulus.
But I think there's something about these things that they can be in some low grade temporary way they can be functional, but in the long run they're not.
Correct.
And also the cue of this is that okay, there's something underneath there. It's Renee Magritte again. There's something underneath there
Yeah,
that you really should be more aware of. The example she uses does fit into
I
what you're
agree.
talking about. Her though, she talks about a child separated from their parents because of illness or hospitalization becomes emotionally unresponsive and apathetic. Right, the emotions get kind of buried, and that almost seems like something that you could learn then, and then it can go on and later on in your life or something
Yeah,
like that. Right,
totally.
but if you're doing this, there's something not quite right. I found this kind of like I don't know. I suppose the more I feel like I've gotten psychologically aware, psychospiritually aware, the more I've been inclined to like wear my heart on my sleeve
Hmm.
and the emotions just kind of go poof, right? And they come out. So it's interesting. I feel like maybe that is a sign. If I look at it just subjectively in myself, maybe that is a sign of some psychospiritual progress in the sense that I don't know if I do this as much anymore. Emotions are pretty up and at the ready, right?
Hmm.
For ill or for good. They're
Yeah,
there,
well,
right?
you get both, you know.
Yeah, you get the ill and the good.
Hmm.
All right. Um, one of the real common ones here that's good to just kind of get rid of and do it is rationalization,
Yes.
right? Where you can find yourself kind of contriving explanations to heal, conceal, or disguise unworthy motives for one's behavior. Um, Technical definition of rationalization. Seems like it could be a little like intellectualization, but
Yeah.
it has the feeling of like not just using the ideas to create a cloud or something. It's of just obscuring everything. It's something where you go through and you say, well, I'm really doing it for this other reason.
Right.
I'm really doing this other reason. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's another one, I suppose, if you see yourself doing this, then you got to be aware that it's a problem.
Well, this
And what do you think?
we talked about this last time, Eric, and I felt like this was often a way for people to take themselves out of feeling things, you know, and move themselves more into a mental state and try by trying to describe step by step their process as if giving me your shitty description of how you do things changes the way in which you do things. It doesn't. You know, like
Yeah, yeah,
it doesn't it doesn't make it any different. You're still avoiding. You're just using a different using a different path to avoid.
yeah. I feel like when you get to the spirituality stuff, I think people will go like, and that does fit into those things that will fuck up your life, right?
Yeah.
Start saying, well, the reason I'm not doing this is like some other thing. I would be doing this more spiritually progressive thing, except there's this whole other set of issues that I have to work on. You have like they talk about in those 9 things.
Mm-hmm.
I, I got to take care of this other stuff in my life. If I once I get these chores done, once I get my to-do list done, or once I get these, then I'm all over that fucking tantra. I'm doing that shit. But
I got it.
first, there's the issues around the house. The porch needs a new coat of paint or whatever it is, right? The rationalization element of it. Yeah.
But that's
And
also
how do you,
what do they call it? Procrastination?
well, that got to what you were talking about, especially in the last 2 of these 9 things that'll fuck up your life, right? They have a procrastinating quality to them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They really do. But now you start saying, well, why are you doing it? I mean, I guess that's the big deal. And then again, the reason you're doing it is because there's something fucking uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Don't want to have to look at. So you rationalize it out. I think that's really hard when you first start doing spiritual practice too, because you come up with all kinds of shit like this.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of reasons why you can't do stuff. You make a whole long fucking list of them. It is true, right? Oh, I can see your eyes going. Are you free? Daniel, real quick. I think you might be freezing in my video thing. Are you freezing?
No, no, I'm good.
Okay. Do I look okay to you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're good.
On my side, you're freezing like crazy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Is the video okay?
Yeah, no,
All
definitely
right.
not freezing. We're good.
Little technical problem.
Technicalities will not be edited. That's live. We don't care. Let's go.
Yeah. Who is it was coming on? Do you edit these things or like, no, not at a
Nah,
second?
dude. What do you think? Bro, I got a life, dude. You know what I mean? This is a hobby. I'm not getting technical. I'm not, anyways.
All right. So we did repression. Oh, so we did rationalization.
Yep.
All right. Then we get to amongst the biggies, probably denial is a big one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the denial and repression are probably good to like just do together real quick. So
Denial and repression, yeah, for sure.
yeah, protecting the self from an unpleasant reality by the refusal to perceive or face it. I think what Anna Freud's trying to get there is when you're directly confronted with something. The example they give is someone who gets research that smoking is dangerous and they like to smoke. So they refuse to accept that research
Mm-hmm.
and they just kind of continue on like that thing just didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then the repression one I think is like the queen of all of these. So to me, it doesn't even look like a separate one. I think it's more like the one that's embedded in all of them,
Sure.
but preventing painful or dangerous thoughts from entering consciousness, just period.
Right.
We talked about Carl Jung's dream with the throne of God and the giant turd falling on the cathedral in Basel or
Yeah.
wherever he grew
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
So this is the purest version of this. Probably all of these have some element of repression, the way I think about it. But
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
the example they give is pretty dramatic here. They talk about a mother's occasional murderous impulses towards her hyperactive 2-year-old are denied access to awareness. So they go very intense on that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the whole idea that you just hold things away are like part of the whole deal behind all of this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think about how this affected me in all my meditative stuff. And I think there are those kind of Carl Jung moments where you can feel like, oh, there's some pressure, some thought has to appear, some idea has to appear until it appears things feel internally uncomfortable. And then, maybe eventually you let it pop out and it does feel better. Do you feel like that's been part of your meditative experience too, Daniel?
Yeah, but I feel like I've been influenced a lot to like really drive your focus, you know? So like you don't really pay much mind on things. You're just sort of like reining yourself back in, it's a constant, a constant looping, a constant loop. Get yourself back in, get yourself back in, get yourself back in. And so those extraneous thoughts are just simply viewed as they are extraneous thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent, you know?
They interfere with your journeying at all or anything like that? Do you ever
Yeah,
find that like,
absolutely. That's
like,
yeah, no
yeah,
doubt. I mean, that is the difficult part in journeying itself is dealing with extraneous thought and what is related to the journey and what is related to just activity of the mind. And this is where most people have the difficult time in threading those two halves together, and I don't mean to be dichotomous, or dualistic, I could say, but really in this part it's finding the gray area that overlaps the dark and the light, and being able to dance in there and feel like you're free to associate, but that you're not required to, in order to have an experience and what that might be.
I always kind of felt like you've been talking about like trying to get around what are the ego thoughts, which would be this kind of stuff
Mm-hmm.
from the more pure content of the shamanic vision. Is that
Mm-hmm.
fair to say?
Absolutely.
It's something like that. Yeah, yeah.
It is a very, very, very subtle, and I'm not going to say it's tricky, but it's something where it's like building another sense, which I know that doesn't really give a great explanation. But it is.
Mhm.
It would be as if you were to, walk around your house with your eyes, or your apartment or wherever you live with your eyes closed as much as you could. Eventually, you would start to have a feeling for like walls and changes in the floor and kind of knowing where things are based on other senses. And the
Yeah.
same thing in those visionary and those experiential spaces, you get the sense for what is your own projection and then what is your kind of like co-creative experiential journey from one scene to the next, or one experience or one realization or whatever it is, the things that you're aware of, the thread that binds, if I can say, if that's.
There's this show I really am loving. It's going to be over at the end of like this season. And I'm not giving away too much if you want to watch it, but it's called Evil. And the guy who's like one of the lead characters is the guy who played Luke Cage. Remember in the old Marvel series on
Yeah,
Netflix?
yeah,
Yeah, I think the actor's name maybe is Mike Coulter.
yeah,
I think I'm that right. Anyways, he plays this priest, and it like kind of follows him having his visions in different seasons of the show. And the show's trying to play with one of the things you brought up earlier, this idea of science versus religion and spirituality. They're kind of asking always questions about that. They have one character or a couple of characters who are very scientific minded people, and he's sort of more this out of the box religious guy. But the gimmick in this heading into the last season is they're trying to use him because he has a talent for remote viewing.
Mhm.
So he's seeing things from afar, and he's kind of involved with like the Vatican version of the CIA or something,
Mm.
which who knows something like that existed. But so they're trying to get him like, some priests are held hostage in some third world country or something. They're trying to get him to get remote viewing of what's going on. And they raise this issue of like, how do you determine what's like your ego structures, right, appearing in the vision in the remote viewing versus like what's the actual thing that you need to see.
Yeah, totally.
They play with it. Yeah, it's interesting. It's been kind of a fun show for that because they take it in these trippy places. There's also a bunch of ones where he's like doing mushrooms or something and trying to have visions of God. It's kind of weird. It was on network television. It's very strange, but like fun. All right, so we did those kinds of two things together.
Yep.
Uh, eventually get to the idea of, I guess fantasy is kind of a weird one just because how they talk about it, right?
Well,
And
fantasy and projection are similar.
oh, I think fantasy has to do with what happens inside your own world, right?
Sure,
So it's kind of like gratifying the frustrating desires by imaginary things in your own mind, right? It's kind of daydreamy or something, right?
sure.
Well, projecting is like, okay, so well, I guess we'll do both of them. We'll see, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What people think about it. Okay, so then they give the example of a socially inept and inhibited young man imagine himself chosen by a group of women to provide them with sexual satisfaction. That's so old school Freud. Anyway, so that's the fantasy thing. I think that can happen meditatively too, right?
Hmm.
Where you find your mind kind of off running into different little fantasy, little dialogues with itself. What do you think about that?
Fantasy, though, in this case, seems only as if it's positive, and it
Oh,
doesn't.
I know that's, is that supposed to be positive, that example? I don't know.
Um, I mean, a socially inept and inhibited young man imagines himself chosen by a group of women to provide them with sexual satisfaction. That seems pretty positive for that, as opposed to
Oh,
denying.
so like going like 4chan or something and like, yeah, I mean,
Well, as opposed to grappling with the maybe the difficulties that he has in reality meeting a partner, right?
I think that's supposed to be the idea, right?
Yeah, but I'm saying that the fantasy itself is only positive. What I'm saying is that the fantasy can also be negative. It could also be contributing to the problem also. I mean, this is contributing to the issue, but making it worse. So the kind of negative self-talk, oh, I ain't, I'm not shit anyways. You know what I mean? Like you kind of browbeat yourself, even with your quote unquote your fantasies are um are not.
Are like kind of are just signs of like hostility towards your own self-image or something like that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So that's why I wanted to just make sure that both sides are, and one I call the negative fantasies projection. I'm not gonna call it that for this discussion because there is
Oh,
something
this is some
that's
language
called.
that you use. Okay, got it. So
Yeah,
this is
this is
something
something
that,
that I use.
okay,
I call it
gotcha.
projection, and I
Okay, cool.
on a regular basis I tell people, really like you can have goals and ideas or plans, right? But those are usually coming from a place of hope or optimism, right? And so you could also call them maybe a bit of a fantasy, but that you're trying to manifest that fantasy through work, however that work looks. But then you can also have projections, and those projections again different from the projection that we're going to be mentioning here in a minute. But this projection is coming from probably a little bit more of a hurt place, and that hurt place is projecting in the future, and it's not going to be accurate. And B is going to be probably worse off than you are now because you're coming from a place of like hurt or a place of despair or a place of sadness, where we tend to think, oh, well, I'm going to be homeless and die, or no one cares about me, and whatever. If I die tomorrow, no. Do you know
Dark
what I'm saying?
thoughts.
So,
Yeah,
no
really
one would
dark.
call that you wouldn't call that a fantasy because it's a terrible fantasy. But we could say we're definitely moving into the future with a kind of psycho-emotional impetus, And if that's coming from a bad place, then that fantasy is going to be a dark, twisted fantasy, like Kanye West album from many years ago.
It's I think it's, is it Christopher Ryan, the guy who wrote Civilized to Death?
I believe so.
Yeah, he makes the whole point. I think we did it all the way back when we were talking about, oh God, what's that part of the brain we were talking about back in the day
Oh, that's
where really
default
hostile?
your default mode
Default
network.
mode network. Yeah, the default mode network. Yeah. And he makes this whole argument that in that civilized to death, that in like more traditional cultures, you don't get as much of that negative self-talk.
Hmm.
People you might diagnose with like schizophrenia, they're not usually like ragging on themselves, the thoughts, even the delusions are not so hostile. They're not so paranoid. They're not so nasty in that way. And
Hmm.
that's kind of just an interesting like little thing with that. Even that part of the mind, maybe in like the kind of cultures that were we're living in and talking about just are more dark. It's interesting, you know.
Hmm.
When you hear the voices in your head, they're not so hostile towards you, you know,
Mm.
in those cultures. Hmm. So you can have more of an imagination of having like an internal voice that you wouldn't think was you, but they'd be kind of nice to you. And then that's probably not schizophrenia anymore, right? So,
You- Yeah, I don't want to go like too deep down this thing, but have been saying recently, I say when someone's external voice matches the negative internal voice in my head, those are hard moments.
oh, gotcha. Someone saying something to you that's also like, oh shit, this is the kind of negative shit I'd say about myself if I let myself, and they
Hmm.
like match up with each other. That's what you're talking about. Yeah,
Hmm.
those are hard moments.
Those are like the opposite of a synchronicity. I mean, they are still synchronistic, but
Yeah,
it goes from a fantasy to a projection. You know what I'm saying?
definitely something negative, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not. Yeah, you're not fantasizing about group sex.
No, you're not fantasizing about group sex. No.
But I mean, like, I think part of the reason why she's doing it is that there's a kind of like if you want to take the fantasy thing in other ways, it's probably anything where potentially you pour your mind into it just to not have to face your shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So probably people do that a lot. And yeah, obviously you think of stuff like the easy access to like online porn and stuff like that. So now you don't even have to fantasize in your mind. You just kind of vicariously live that thing through somebody else. But it's probably, and like, we're okay with a little bit of that when when we've had, neither one of us are big porn people. We're just not, right?
Right.
So I don't have judgments about that. You can watch some erotic materials if, it gets your rocks up, there's no problem. But of
Hmm.
course, there's the whole thing about like people getting absorbed into these fantasy things, right? And then
Hmm.
the whole issue I think that she's raising there is that then that becomes something where you don't really look at yourself. You just kind of throw your mental energies into these fantastical things. And I think a lot of the other stuff is like that too, like playing video games or something, right? You're just doing some
Hmm.
bullshit, acting out in some fantastic other world setting so you don't have to like
Yeah.
face the harder things of your own life. I guess that's where I take that fantasy thing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I guess projection was going to be next, and projection
Yeah.
seems to me to be a bit related to this idea of displacement. So maybe we'll bang both of those out, right?
Yeah.
So projection, attributing one's unacceptable motives or characteristics to others. So you go through, and obviously we've all been either done this or had it done to us or something. The whole thing of, going, you're so selfish, you're so this way, you're so that way, but actually it's really you.
Hmm.
And later on you have to face the fact of, oh, wait a minute, that was me. I was the one doing that. Um, and then also displacement. The idea of it says discharging pent-up feelings, often of hostility on objects that are less dangerous than those that initially aroused the feeling. I think of kind of a typical example here: a woman harassed by her boss at work initiates an argument with her significant other. So, that whole idea, this is really more kind of watching, I suppose, how you start like interacting with others, or at least start interacting with others in your mind, even,
Hmm.
right?
It's also
You sit there.
bullying. It's also bullying.
Yeah, yeah, true, 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 true. I suppose in the meditative sense, sometimes you might feel like you sit there and your mind is bullshitting around and it goes, wow, this other person really has these issues or this or other thing. And then you have to face that it's actually you. I think that does happen. And then I
Mm-hmm.
think also you could be sitting there going, boy, like that Cindy is constantly giving me shit. And, I'm going to like take it out on that Cindy, but actually you're really mad at Molly,
Right.
your ex-girlfriend, something like that. So, okay,
Hmm.
those are the two ideas with that. What do you make out of those in your meditative practice? That shit been anything at all that speaks to you?
Um, no, not really. Not, I
Okay.
mean, yeah, no. Other ones, but not those.
Sometimes with some of the stuff I've done, like when I was doing Zen and you just count your breath, the mind can get a little rambly behind the breath counting.
For sure.
You and I have talked about that before. And sometimes you
Mhm.
find yourself, again, these are kind of patterns of thought, then potentially, right? I guess is the
Yeah.
pitch with it.
Yeah.
You kind of look at yourself and go, okay, wait a minute. Why am I getting all these hostile feelings towards this person? The idea would be sometimes behind those, what you're really feeling is anger towards somebody else and you're displacing it.
Sure.
Or what's really happening is like it has more to do with like aspects of yourself you have to face and realize that you just want to kind of force onto someone else. Those are the
Yeah.
two big. And when
Yeah.
that's happening, then there's something funky going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. A few others. This one, the regression came up today in kind of an interesting way. Retreating to an earlier developmental level involving less mature behavior and responsibility. Um, so yeah, I was talking with a friend from grad school, and she just started saying, what happens to a lot of the people is they kind of freeze under at some level of development. I mean, I literally had this conversation this afternoon, and she was saying, they get kind of stuck there. And then when you really look more closely at what they're doing, you can realize, oh, that's the stuckness of a 16-year-old or the stuckness of an 18-year-old or something, even though now they're 40 or whatever. And I think there's something to that too, right? Where you can kind of look at yourself and realize, man, I'm acting in a way that isn't as mature as what I really am. I better like look and see what's hiding behind that. I think that's the notion. And it's funny because you just brought it up. We were talking about someone that we both kind of know, and she went, what I really think that is I think that person's just stuck somehow, right? And the ways that they're acting are like coming from that place. Yeah. Is that conversations you have with patients or people that you work with a lot, Daniel? That kind of stuff?
Regression. I think sometimes, well, I mean, but I used to have a lot of patients and stuff who have kids, so so sometimes, I don't know, I feel like when people are acting immature, it's a state of regression. And I feel like it gets people's behavior, that immature behavior gets masked as
Mhm.
other things, oh, that's just the way they are. That's kind of like a personality quirk, but um, it's totally a regressive behavior.
I guess I should look at these. I mean, like, this is funny going through these because you start to look at them for yourself.
Oh yeah,
You, Man, do I sometimes act like I'm coming at things from more the point of view of a younger person? I wonder.
hmm,
Wonder. Okay. Maybe do a couple others, then we'll like say that we did it full
yeah,
justice here.
yeah.
Uh there's an undoing. So it says atoning for or magically trying to dispel unacceptable acts and desires. These kind of like a weird one. It almost sounds a little OCD in the example. A teenager who feels guilty about masturbation touches a doorknob a certain number of times or something like that to get rid of the guilt. I think people do this kind of stuff too,
Oh
right?
yeah, it's called superstition, man.
No, but also the idea like I felt this sometimes in like how sometimes you can talk with yourself, well, I'm doing something shitty in this part of my life, but in that part of my life, I'm killing it. And
Sure.
that's making up for this other thing, where that like I'm really doing pretty mediocre. So I wonder about that. I think I've caught myself doing that on occasion. I've been doing
Mm,
great on this thing, and that's not going to solve the problems of this other thing. And then maybe there's some weird emotions going on behind that. In this case, they're mentioning somebody who feels guilty doing something weird in some other part of life. I think people
mhm.
do that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah,
I might sit down and do this negative thing, but in this other part, I gave $5 to the reelection campaign of the candidate of my choice or something, and
right,
solved it that way. Kind of a
right.
weird psychological thing that people can do. Or undo. Yeah, yeah,
Undo,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Identification is kind of an interesting one. Increasing feelings of worth by affiliating myself or affiliating oneself with a person or institution of illustrious standing.
Oh yeah,
People do this. People do this a lot, you know, whether it's like we're from Chicago, so whether you identify with one of the local sports teams, which is a big Chicago thing to do, or I know people who do that sometimes with like music artists, right? They'll identify really strong, and it's kind of interesting. I'm thinking of people that I know when we talk about this, and they'll identify with some particular performer or some particular other famous person, and they'll really like the qualities of this person. And I sometimes have had the thought, well, maybe you should develop those qualities.
I mean,
You like the fact they're very like outside the box or something. And like, well, maybe that's what you're really admiring in them. So maybe you should just do that. And then you won't have to identify with them. You'll identify with yourself.
To me, this just screams of that. To me, isn't that religion? Isn't that
Naturally
all of
so.
them? Isn't
Yeah,
that, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
what you just said is all of them, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, I could never. I'm a Christian, and you're like, oh, okay. And
Yeah, yeah,
yet,
yeah.
all these behaviors, whatever, or whatever, fill in the religion of choice that you want there. I could never do that.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, well, it sure seems like you're doing it. So, okay.
yeah. Well, that kind of overlaps with the undoing thing. I
Hmm.
did this really shitty stuff, but I went to church and I put 10 whole dollars when they put that thing through. I just reached in my pocket and put all 10 of them in there,
Hmm. How many
and
Hail
then just
Marys? But Eric, if we're
yeah,
going to be honest, let's keep it up. Let's keep it a buck, right?
yeah,
Undoing. How is that?
yeah.
How is that outside of the realm of purification in in some of the meditative practices from
Gallic Rinpoche had the whole thing of the 4 R's, which I don't know if I'm gonna be able to like
do it
pull
justice?
all of them, but he would say that you have to be willing to like refrain and repent. Repent's kind of a weird word because it has all those
Yeah.
Christian overtones. But like you want to be able to do those things where you're not just like, well, okay, fuck it, I'll just purify this thing again.
That's
Buying
cool.
an indulgence from like Tara or something,
I got this
you
whole
know?
bottle of holy water, man. I'm straight.
Yeah. I just did, and I just did 500 mantras. I did 5 malas that made up for that other thing I did
Yeah, I'm
that I
good.
feel not good about. Yeah.
Back to the
Yeah. I mean,
casino tomorrow.
it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, I mean, that's a danger, right?
Hmm.
And the trickster psychology of the ego,
Hmm.
the existential guardian operating system. Um, yeah, the identification thing. I mean, I suppose there's problems with that. I think if I look back in the day, I think there were parts of me that would try to do little bits like this. I used to read like biographies. Like I could read a biography of like Jimi Hendrix or something because I was playing guitar, right? And I would think, okay, you'd start to try to identify a little bit with this person in some way, probably because I was a teenager, I didn't feel as good about myself. If I look back in the time machine, right? So all of a sudden you're like kind of going, okay, what's Jimmy like? Maybe I'll try to be a little bit more like Jimmy, you know? And I grew out of that thing. But I mean, you could see that there's a real danger in that, right? I could feel like I see that in adult people, they'll identify really, well, I mean, obviously political candidates which was one of your things
Yeah.
you were talking about too, right?
Yeah.
That part. Yeah. All right. Anyway, so that's one that you can realize there's something funky going on. I
Definitely.
should watch that too. Um, okay, some of these look a little bit similar, but overcompensation and covering up perceived weaknesses by emphasizing a desirable characteristic or making up for gratification in one area by overgratification in another. They kind of give a good example to illustrate this one. It's someone who has a problem with obesity that goes into like eating binges, kind of almost like binge eating as a diagnostic psychological thing when they feel neglected by their husband or something.
Mhm.
You go through and you feel bad about some part of your life and you find yourself over consuming or overacting in some other part to cover up the fact that you feel bad about your life in other ways.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of them, kind of like the fantasy thing and some of these other ones, stop you from doing proactive, constructive things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an
Yeah.
avoidant. It's just a manifestation of an avoidant pattern.
Yeah, yeah. Which is like the last of these 9 things that'll fuck up your life, right? They're very much like that, right? You sort of
Mm-hmm.
know you're one thing and you feel bad about it, you compensate someplace else. All right,
Hmm.
cool. Acting out. So engaging in antisocial excessive behavior without regard to negative consequences as a way of dealing with emotional stress. An unhappy, frustrated sales representative has several indiscriminate affairs without regard to the negative effects of the behavior. So in this case, it's someone who, again, it's like it's a little bit like the overcompensation thing. I think that's the reason to kind of talk about those things kind of together, right? And that one, the person is probably doing things that they know they wouldn't otherwise feel good about, but they do it in a way that helps them deal with some other negative emotions that otherwise they're not willing to face. Mm.
Hmm.
I'm trying to figure out if that's been a major thing in my life or not. I definitely know other people who have done this a lot.
Mm.
I don't want to just point the fingers at others with these things. I mean, I'm sure I've done this too.
Right, because that would be projection.
Guilty, guilty,
Guilty.
guilty.
Oh, well, don't worry, Eric. If you say 30 Hail Marys, I will absolve you of all of your sins.
I don't want to undo. I want to
Yeah,
really fix this.
yeah.
I've looked at it. I think I was having an interesting conversation about people, whether I'm a trickster or not. I think when we talked about it. Yeah, we did talk about it too. When I first started like getting into the meditation more intensely, and I was kind of jetting up like this part of myself that was going to disagree with the societal rules. Like that was going to happen.
Mhm,
I was going to disagree with them. This is probably the
mhm,
best example of this, actually. I was going to disagree from my own life. I was going to disagree with them. And I started like, I did probably act out in ways where I was like, you know what? The rule is this, fuck it. I'm not just going to violate this thing. I'm going to really violate this thing. This is probably going more back, even in my like pre-grad school days and things like that. I would sometimes do stuff like that,
mhm,
you know? And I think I was doing that in a way that I guess was dealing with emotional stress. Probably that's true. And it was also kind of a true acting out where I hadn't kind of figured out where my own boundaries and ideas were about what I thought was true,
mm,
what I thought things should be. And so then I acted in ways that were kind of more provocative or something. That's a little bit how I got into the Jung thing. Maybe we talked about it in those episodes. I can't remember, but I realized like, wow, I'm being too fucking trickstery.
mm,
I'm doing too much of this. I better get this under control. Like I felt I was a little bit under the thrall of a trickster archetype. Um, I don't feel that way anymore. And it's interesting. I don't feel that way anymore personally, just because, like we were talking about, I feel like the rules of the world that I disagree with, I just disagree with. And I don't give them a reality more than what they have. I kind of just see them as like, well, that's what they say in this society, or those are the conventional truths of this particular group of people. And I just disagree with them. So I kind of took away the reality of those things, and then the trickster thing kind of changed. And I think the acting out thing changed for me too. Whatever I was doing of that started to go away.
mm.
And have you had any experience like that in your meditative or spiritual development?
No, I'm perfect. So,
Yeah, where's that one on the list?
avoidance. What is that one?
Yeah.
All of
Uh-huh.
them.
It's
Intellect.
intellectualization
That's all of them.
probably. um
Rationalization. It's all of them. Repression.
rationalization, yeah. All
Yeah.
right, couple last ones, and we will be done with all of Anna Freud. Splitting. Interesting one. Viewing oneself or others as all good or all bad without integrating positive or negative qualities into the evaluations. Reacting to others in an all or none manner rather than considering the full range of their qualities. That's funny because we were just talking about this shit earlier today outside
Yeah.
of any pot. That's easy for people to do this.
There. Yeah. Yeah.
I think you were even talking about like, okay, man, like this person's 90% positive, but I'm going to latch on to whatever the negative things about them that I might have not happen to like, and I'm going to make them 100% negative. That 90-10 split just went 100-0, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's the way in which that, like I'll just explain it a little bit. So I was just kind of talking with Eric earlier about some relationships that we have, and everybody has relationships with some people that are closer or further away, right? And no relationship with anybody is 100% perfect. Everybody, there's always some wrinkles. It doesn't matter. And depending on the depth of your friendship, some of those wrinkles are more like, tsunamis, and those are your enemies, and other ones is very small and not a big deal. But no relationship is completely perfect. But there are some instances or occurrences or situations that could happen in life that, instead of viewing your whole relationship as something that has some ripples in it, you you can change your perspective to only see ripples, to only see and only experience static. And once that occurs, then your view of that person goes from being, for the most part, good, and you have good memories about them, and you give them the benefit of the doubt, to all that shit was bullshit and
Yeah.
no benefit of anything. You are all the things that I could possibly think negatively about. You are in the embodiment of all of them. And sometimes it doesn't really take that much, unfortunately, you know?
Yeah.
And that's how things like this, that's how relationships can flip and how, friendships can change. It's this very thing right here, this splitting. And that's because we are unable to acknowledge that all of us have quote unquote good and bad qualities, or we could say like attractive or repulsive qualities based upon how we view people and what our thoughts are about them at that time. And the inability to hold all of those qualities up together and view them as a synthetic being, knowing that people are inherently are going to make mistakes. They're going to do things that may go against your, code of ethics or how you view the world or whatever the case is. The question is can you still see them as the being that you saw them for yesterday? It may mean that the relationship might evolve, of course. But ultimately it's up to that person to remember who they saw not that long ago, because ultimately I don't think that that person is actually that different, like they're really not. But this is how I see it. I tend
It's
to like
interesting because,
I tend to like to forgive if I can.
yeah, I think like the splitting thing has a lot to do with what you were talking about earlier, because I think you can turn this on yourself too.
Yeah.
You can say, okay, I'm all good or all bad or something,
Hmm.
right? People will flip in this way on themselves, right? So to me, I mean, I get the words, the language you were using, right? That negative internal voice that like
Hmm.
just like asks you all the time. But I think that's
Hmm.
a splitting too.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you go from I'm okay to now I'm all bad or something, right?
Hmm.
I don't know what this means in terms of like spirituality. I've often had the thought that like this particular American culture that we live in likes to do this. It's a
Yeah.
kind of a puritanical culture. And so there is almost a thing like if you're all good, you can be all good. But once there's a sliver of like Satan or like, the bad influence enters in, then all of a sudden the person's completely corrupted and
Hmm.
everything goes down the shitter or something. It's an interesting thing. And I almost feel like it's like something deep,
It's a fucking joke.
American culture. It's so
It's a
deep.
fucking joke, man.
It's kind of like the Scarlet Letter or, those kinds of things. This person did this something, and now all of a sudden they're in in what's the word I'm looking for? Not imputed, but anyways, they're condemned to the entirety of their character or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. Yeah. To the
There's
core.
no
Rotten.
redeeming qualities in them anymore. Yeah, it's a
Heath.
tough one. And then you wonder if, like, if you're willing to do that to others, then you're probably willing to turn that on yourself too.
I'm assuming so. Yeah.
And then there's something really, I was talking about the show Evil earlier. There's something really potentially evil about that,
Hmm.
right? But sometimes it can kind of come under the guise of certain kinds of approaches to religiosity or
Hmm.
spirituality or something
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
That's why I thought like the Asian paths were so interesting for me. Now I don't know how it feels for people who are raised in them in Asia. I wasn't, but they just didn't have as much of this,
Mm.
this all or nothing, good or bad kind of feeling to them. I kind of given the example, one of the Polish ladies that was at one of the first Buddhist Tantra retreats. She's this older, nice Polish lady. And she was saying, like, well, that's one of the things that she liked in Asian spirituality too. Like people didn't have to go to hell just because they did a little bit of bad stuff or something, right?
Yeah. Just because
Everyone
you
had a
did
good,
some.
pure nature at the core, right?
Yeah. Bub's not going to stab you in the butthole every day for the next 100 years because you did a little cocaine last weekend. Like, chill out.
Undo it. Just go through, do the mantras, go to the local church,
Yeah,
throw a few bucks in the collection plate, problem
whatever, man.
solved.
Wash that away. You take some of that holy water, you
Touch that doorknob 17 times, boom,
yeah, but you're
solved.
you're good.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think because I think that's a danger in spirituality where it hits to religiosity. It can get a
Mm,
little bit like, you know, you start feeling bad about yourself, you know, but that's better if you realize, oh no, I have a Buddha nature. I'm good, right?
mhm.
I'm not bad at the core or something.
I'm
Yeah.
actually good at the core.
Original sin, right? Original sin. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. All right. Last two real quick. Sublimation. channeling frustrated desires. They mentioned sexual energy into substituted practices. And they're putting a lot of emphasis on this one on the sexual stuff, but it probably can come in other places too,
Oh,
you know?
Eric, you said that really fast, man.
Did I?
Yeah.
Okay. I was overexcited by it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Channel frustrated sexual energy into substitutive activities.
Yes.
But the other thing I was trying to say was that probably it also has to do with just any kinds of desires that might be frustrated. It maybe doesn't just have to be sexual.
Yeah, correct. Correct.
So to give the example of a sexually frustrated artist paints wildly erotic pictures. Probably almost any of these things. I guess that's worthwhile looking at oneself too. Do you find that you sublimate stuff? This is one of the ones where Freud's kind of weird about it, if we just the psychology of it. He says that some of this is sort of healthy if you really can't go through
Yeah.
and have some of these desires fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
You can not just, let's say, disappear into fantasy or some of these other things. You can go through and take that energy and use that into some other part of life
Yeah,
that is life affirming, creative, and etc. Right?
you're
Mm-hmm.
alchemizing you're using it as fuel for the, fire of existence, your creative fire, or that's the alchemical fire, right? That's exactly what that is.
Yeah, we're supposed to when you do talk about like tantric sexual meditation, I mean, part of that is a kind of a sublimation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go through and you use some of those sexual feelings and you like kind of in a certain sense pour it into the meditative activity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you use eroticisms to do that. You use that eroticism to do that. So I mean, that could be good, right? And then people do that in other aspects of life. So I think of all of these, I think this is considered to be one of the more healthy ones. I worked with a
Right.
woman who couldn't have kids. She was in her mid to late 50s, and she just did all these volunteer things around kids and volunteer things at the zoo. And just, that's a sublimation, right?
Yeah, yeah,
On
yeah,
some
yeah.
level, there's a longing for her own children that she can't have, but you direct it into some other place. So I suppose it's one to look at, right? I mean, if I think about this in my own life and maybe especially how this is handled in sort of the Buddhist tantras too, I think, okay, there can be positive aspects to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a broken heart over the lover who's gone, and you recognize those feelings of longing for them and you pour that into your tantric meditation or something. I definitely feel like there's been times when I've done things like that. And it's a way of taking those energies, which otherwise could be negative, and pushing them into more positive places.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's interesting because then that like can become almost kind of blissful. And then that's kind of healing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe that lady gets the joy of being around those children and it like heals. So, anyways, ups and downs of these things. But I suppose it takes a certain amount of awareness, right?
Yeah, you have to kind of you have to have that's an intentional act, you know?
Yes.
That's an intentional act. You may not necessarily know, oh, I'm doing this because of that, but you know that what you're doing fulfills you in a very particular kind of a way. And so
Yeah.
those are enlightened, those are acts, those are compassionate acts. What does Lama Glenn call it? Enlightenment activity.
Enlightenment activities. Yeah, I wonder if that awareness part is really important in this one, though. I think that's the point they might be making. If this is done in sort of a semi-unaware way,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe you don't get the full
Right,
feeling because it won't really transform it then. Then the tantra, the alchemy can't happen because you don't
right,
really
right.
fully transform it.
Mm.
All right, the last one. Ooh, interesting. Ends with a closer. Fixation. Big finish. Attaching oneself in an unreasonable or exaggerated way to some person or arresting emotional development on a childhood or adolescent level. I feel that is more like the regression thing. The attachment thing is kind of interesting. The example they give is an unmarried middle-aged man still depends on his mother to provide his basic needs.
Mm.
But yeah, something about that. Been talking with a lot of people about like love and the meaning of love. You know, I think because we do these episodes where we talk about a lot of these things so honestly, and we've done episodes where we've had really honest conversations about these things. People will sometimes I find people talk to me, sometimes it's in relationship. Either they're talking they start talking to me and then they listen to these episodes, or sometimes maybe a vice versa. But the idea like of this is a deep one, right?
Mhm.
So I suppose maybe the deepest part of this for me would be deciding when is it kind of right to have those kinds of deep feelings for someone and when is it kind of not right. That's probably the thing that one has to tease apart in this, right?
Mm.
When is this psycho-spiritually healthy and when is this something that's more problematical that one would have to identify as something that would need to be worked on. I mean, I think that's interesting, right? I put a lot of stock. I was talking with a student who's going through all kinds of really interesting psycho-spiritual changes, and we were talking about Rumi. And I really admire that part of Rumi, that he was willing to like attach himself in some way to someone as a transformative activity. Like I
Right.
respect it, admire it, and I have personally woven it into my own like Buddhist philosophy. I've taken those Sufi ideas and I've said, okay, they're going to become part of my path. On the tantric level, I include them, in the self-conscious way, going, this has to be included and this is my choice.
Yeah.
But maybe it is something to look at oneself and go, okay, when is this right? When is this psychologically healthy or when is this psychologically unhealthy? I suppose the
Well,
point in the example is it's a guy who needs to get over like just being tied in only to his mother or something like that.
so
But
Eric,
we could look at those in the romantic relationships and the relationships that we have. Yeah.
one other artist asked a question like this before. What is love? And I will read you an excerpt from this. What is love? Oh, I don't know why you're not fair. I give you my love, but you don't care. So what is right and what is wrong? Give me a sign. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more.
That might be something that might be like a criteria I would have to take to heart.
Yes.
I better write that into my long live. My long
Yeah, please.
don't they do that like on SNL? The guys just constantly
Yeah,
like
for sure. That's a classic, man.
that thing. It's Will
Yeah.
Ferrell and the other guy, right?
Yeah, Chris
Uh,
Kattan.
Chris Kattan. Wow. SNL deep cut from Daniel.
Mhm.
The mighty Chris Kattan. Um, yeah, okay. I mean that's an interesting question.
Yeah,
I was writing someone recently about this. And I was saying, yeah, I guess I do have to like make sure. I feel like the people that I feel like I'm connected with, there's a reason. You know, I don't
sure.
feel like it's just some crazy talk. And in general, it's not like some like unrequited thing or something.
Yeah.
When I have attachments with people, there's usually something that's reciprocal in that, whether it works out or not.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as baby don't hurt me no more, it
Mm-hmm.
is interesting because I think, okay, I was saying this, like, okay, maybe I have to look at that and make sure that I go through and choose the people who are going to reciprocate in ways that are kind enough or something. I wonder
Yep.
about that.
Yep.
And then you'll know. I guess the other part of that too is like, is this making you psychospiritually better, this person? If this is a person who's not going to make you psychospiritually better and you have all these unreasonable or exaggerated attachments, that's probably negative, right?
Probably. I don't know. I mean, I feel like you want to have a lens of discernment, in terms of where you're spending your time, energy, resources, whatever. But if you're doing the real alchemy thing, as a deep level practice, then any and every interaction that you're going to have could potentially yield you something of value. Now, that's not to say that you could do whatever, but um you should be able to. If you're doing the turn, or you're turning all of it into potential enlightenment activity, then nothing is necessarily off the table. And that's kind of the point, right? Is that you can live your life in the way that you want. You can ride a bull backwards, stare at the world from his ass, essentially, and go, yeah, that's perfect. Just
I'm doing Buddha nature right now.
right, exactly.
Out the asshole of this bull. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Now, totally, obviously, you want to kind of like align your life so that you can, have some kind of ethical and moral guidelines to give yourself by, and you want to be doing the deep internal dives and not, intellectualizing and all this other kind of thing. But on, the other hand, you want to feel like what occurs for you is occurring for you at that particular time, and you have the practice, wherewithal, understanding, and most importantly, awareness to take things and break them down into their component pieces so that you know what it is that you're going to assimilate and what it is that you're going to let go.
It's interesting for me is if I really think about this one, and I've asked myself this question, I think I even wrote Lama Glenn a little bit about this, right? Lama Glenn Mullen, one of our spiritual mentors and Dharma friends, um, kind of asking about, like if I look at myself kind of honestly, I would say the things that I've engaged in where there's been sort of like deeper attachments to people,
Yeah.
right? I can't say that I didn't get a lot of reward and benefit from that. I
Mm-hmm.
did. But I've also sometimes had to ask myself a really tough question, which was something like, yes, but even though that was true,
Mm-hmm.
was that situation with that person correct in that they were really someone who warranted that amount of an energy being poured into that thing? I've asked myself that question a lot
Yeah.
in my
Again,
life. I have asked myself that. Not to say that I didn't get benefit from it too. So I guess both those things can be correct.
yes.
Right. You can be getting the benefit, but then also look at that as a personality trait,
See,
and start
you're
going, yep,
you're already avoiding intellectualization. Eric, look at you.
I'm doing the best I can, man.
That's it. That's it.
I'm trying.
You're
I'm
doing
trying.
you're
But to be
doing just
honest
fine.
about it,
You're
to be
doing
honest,
great. You're almost there.
thanks, Daniel. You're
Yeah,
helping me overcome my various feelings of internal splitting
I love it.
of myself as all good or all bad.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I know. I mean, I think that's worth. I mean, I'm doing that. I've done that too. I mean, I can think of
yeah,
one person. We haven't seen each other in years, but I've always had this question of like, yeah, I definitely am learning though. This is a hard road
yeah.
we're riding.
Mm-hmm.
It's
But
not a
it's a good.
simple ride backwards on the ass of a bull. No, it's a full on fucking rodeo. And all
That's
the
right.
rodeo clowns are running out in case you got thrown on your head.
Yeah,
And I have to be like, okay. And I had friends who would be like, "What the fuck are you doing?
it's all right.
What the
Better
fuck
to.
is wrong with you?" And I was like, "Well, it's a little quixotic. Sometimes you got to charge a windmill."
Yeah,
Well, I
but
couldn't say I didn't learn. I did.
all we're pointing these out because we're coming to the end of our discussion on the obstacles that can fuck up your life, and these are internal obstacles that that can definitely manifest externally in some of these specific ways, but we're just trying to highlight obstacles that people are inevitably going to run into, because this
Mm.
is they say, or Mary Kay likes to say, common things are common.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
these are, this is a list of ways that we all cope, that we all survive, that we all adapt, if you will. And it's not necessarily that you want to like avoid things. It's just a matter of understanding how it is that we react, and then developing the ability to emancipate yourself from unconscious reactions and to
Mm.
choose, is this what I'm choosing now? And if the answer is yes, then okay, then you can at least accept responsibility for that choice. But if the answer is no, or you're not even aware of it, then it's very difficult to uh take responsibility for something that you're not even sure why you did that or what you even might have done. And it makes learning and growth very difficult, very difficult, because you're not even the one really calling the shots. It's genetic, or it's influential from what you saw other people do. Like eventually you want your actions or reactions or both to be yours, of your accord, coming from the inside out. And the way in which I think we're trying to present this is through through understanding and realization of many of these patterns that are going to happen, as the Taoists have highlighted, and now who some as we've numerous psychologists have highlighted, that now we've talked about at least a half a dozen psychologists and all the various permutations of what
I
what these things look like. Yeah.
like Jung talks about individuation in exactly that way. You're not being deluded by the internal parts of yourself that are trying to like delude you, and you're not deluded by the external world,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I guess
Exactly.
it's that like the capper might be like, you don't have to do splitting and view yourself all negative or all positive. You have these things in you, right?
Hmm.
I think there's something about like I think the Tibetan Buddhist world does a good job with this. I didn't get as much of this in the Zen spaces, for example, but they do a good job of going, well, okay, pick something and like fix it, work on it.
Mm-hmm.
Realize you got something, just say, okay, that's a major one. Let me start working on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if you get that one better, then you can move on to something else. Right. You try to
Legos.
solve these things as go forward. What was that? Legos?
Legos.
Well, that might be regression, Daniel. I'm not going to try to like yuck your yum.
They could be big ones.
Hey, those are for even the younger kids, but okay. They're really big ones that like fill up most of my hand.
Well, I spent a lot of money on this house and it's built by small Legos. Oh, wait, those are bricks. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So we did it, right? So
Yeah.
we're gonna like probably wrap up the last two of our things that can fuck up your life. Maybe one episode, maybe two.
Yep.
But this is sort of more like, why do people do these things? And hopefully some psychology of this helped. All right, cool. Thank you,
Agreed.
Danny.
All right, Eric, thank you so much as always. Appreciate the ride and the journey and all the things. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you find our work useful, please share with other people. Like, comment, subscribe if you're on the YouTube, or if you're on another platform, leave us a like, or I don't know, whatever you can do. Do it. Helps the show reach some other folks. We definitely do that. As always, for Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.